Welcome to part 3 of abdominal anatomy. In part 3, we are going to discuss structures found within the abdominal cavity, and there are 4 new terms that we need to discuss. First is peritoneum, mesentery, omentum, and mesocolon. So we're going to talk about these in great detail, but I've also included a video here on YouTube that may help as you're studying the abdominal cavity and the peritoneum. This video may help. Now we're going to watch this video in class as well, but if you want to watch it again on your own, please do. So let's start by discussing peritoneum. Okay, so most abdominal structures and organs, in addition to the wall of the abdominal cavity, are covered by a large, serous, double-walled membrane called the peritoneum. Okay, so just think of it as a membrane. There are 2 types of peritoneum: parietal peritoneum, which covers the abdominal cavity wall, and visceral peritoneum, which covers an organ, because remember, viscera refers to organ. Now, interestingly, the total surface area of the peritoneum is equal to the total surface area of the skin that covers our entire body. So the peritoneum is a large structure, much like our skin. So let's just reiterate. The peritoneum is a membrane that covers structures in the abdominal cavity. There are 2 types of peritoneum: parietal, which covers the abdominal cavity wall, and visceral, which covers an organ. Okay, so we have 2 membranes, parietal and visceral. The space or cavity between the parietal and visceral peritoneum is known as the peritoneal cavity. And this should sound familiar because this is similar to what we see in the thoracic cavity. Remember, in the thoracic cavity, we have 2 layers of pleura with a cavity in between. So this is same concept in the abdominal cavity, 2 layers with a cavity in between. And again, in reality, no space exists, as the cavity is actually filled with organs and a serous, lubricating type fluid, which allows organs to move against each other without friction. And when I say serous, that refers to a pale yellow or transparent fluid found within our body cavities. So it just allows, it's like a lubricating type fluid that allows movement without friction. Okay. Too much serous fluid in the peritoneal cavity is called ascites, and we'll discuss that more later in the unit when we learn pathology. So let's look at our diagram for a second. So peritoneal cavity is here. You have the parietal peritoneum, which lines the abdominal cavity wall, and then parts of the peritoneum also encapsulate or encircle the organs, and that's called visceral. And we'll look at additional diagrams, but I just wanted to kind of get your mind going. Okay, so we defined peritoneum. Our next word that we're going to define is mesentery. I'm going to point out all of these terms that I'm discussing on the diagram, but let's learn the terms first. Mesentery is a double fold of peritoneum that extends anteriorly from the posterior abdominal wall to completely envelop a loop of small bowel. Okay, so to summarize, mesentery is a type of peritoneum that connects loops of small bowel to the posterior abdominal wall. So let me point that out. So here is mesentery, okay, and it's connecting or holding in place, really, all of these loops of small intestine. But the mesentery does more than just hold the small intestine in place. It also serves to provide blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves to those parts of the small intestine. Okay, so whenever you hear mesentery, I want you to think small intestine. Mesentery connects small intestine to the back of the abdomen, and it really, again, helps to hold those loops of bowel in place. Okay, next word is omentum. Omentum is another type of peritoneum. It's again a double fold of peritoneum that extends from the stomach to another organ. So we have two types of omentum. We have the lesser omentum, and guess what? That extends from the lesser curvature of the stomach to the liver. So just in case you haven't looked at a stomach in a while, here's a stomach. The lesser curvature is here. Okay, so the lesser omentum connects the stomach to the liver, and you can see that right here. Okay, again, kind of helps support our organs and keeps them in place. The greater omentum connects the transverse colon to the greater curvature of the stomach. So here is your greater curvature of your stomach. So the greater omentum connects the greater curvature of the stomach to the transverse colon. So kind of imagine the transverse colon was kind of sitting right here. The greater omentum, and again you can see that here on our diagram, connects the greater curvature of the stomach to the transverse colon. Now, transverse colon is right here. It's not labeled on our diagram, but this is meant to be transverse colon. Okay, so look at how big the greater omentum is. Okay. Let's continue. Let's look at our omentum a little bit more. So the greater omentum, remember, connects the greater curvature of the stomach to the transverse colon. You can see that right here. Okay. That actually drapes down over our small intestine and then folds back on itself to form an apron along the anterior abdominal wall. So if we go back a slide, can you see how it comes down and then folds back up and kind of makes an apron? And that's what you're seeing here. This is the greater omentum covering the small intestine. So if you were to cut open the abdomen, the first structure you would see once you cut through that membrane or that parietal peritoneum would be the greater omentum. And within the greater omentum, there are deposits of fat, and it actually acts as a layer of insulation between the abdominal cavity and our exterior. The greater omentum is often nicknamed the fatty apron. Okay. All right, so let's go back a slide. Here's your greater omentum. Can you see how it looks like an apron? Fatty apron, it covers the small intestine. But I need you to remember the lesser omentum connects stomach and liver. The greater omentum connects transverse colon and stomach. And again, I think about it as, you know, if I stood up, why don't all my organs fall down, like fall in my abdominal cavity when you're standing? It's because these layers of peritoneum help hold things in place. Okay? In addition to providing blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, etc. Okay, next word is mesocolon. So the type of peritoneum that attaches the colon or large intestine to the posterior abdominal wall is called the mesocolon. And there are 4 types of mesocolon, each named according to the portion of the colon that it attaches to. Okay, so ascending mesocolon attaches the ascending colon to the posterior abdominal wall. Transverse mesocolon attaches the, and you can see that here, attaches to the transverse colon and then the abdominal posterior wall. Descending and then sigmoid or pelvic. Again, you can see here this transverse mesocolon is the visceral peritoneum that loosely connects the transverse colon to the posterior abdominal wall. So you'd have mesocolon here, you'd have mesocolon here, and again, it just holds those structures in place and provides blood vessels and lymphatic vessels. Okay, this illustration shows two parts of the peritoneal cavity. Okay, the major portion of the peritoneal cavity is known as the greater sac. So kind of all of this is the greater sac of the peritoneum, kind of in black here. We often, rather than calling that the greater sac, we just call that the peritoneal cavity because it's really, a pretty large space. But it is technically called the greater sac. A smaller portion of the upper posterior peritoneal cavity, which is behind the stomach, is called the lesser sac. So here's the stomach. So up and behind of the stomach is peritoneum that we call the lesser sac. Okay. The lesser sac is also called the omentum bursa. Everything has to have two names. Okay, we're going to pause part 3 here. We're going to practice with these 4 new terms in class. We're going to watch a video. So, for now, just get comfortable with what parts of the intestine are connected by what parts of peritoneum, and we'll continue to practice. Okay, so don't worry. We're going to pause here, and we'll pick up with organ placement in part 4.